War I had ended, but for over 5,000 U.S. soldiers, the war had just begun. Fighting Russian Bolsheviks in minus 40-degree weather, a worse tragedy was about to appear: betrayal by their own government. Hi, I'm Paul Carter, coming to you from Thailand. Thank you for joining me. The decided policy of abandoning U.S. soldiers on the battlefield did not begin with the conflict in hot, muggy, leech-infested jungles of Southeast Asia. Rather, 50 years earlier in the freezing Arctic Russian tundra, where over 5,000 U.S. soldiers fought communist Bolsheviks after World War I had ended. It was there that captured and missing American soldiers were officially designated killed in action, body not recovered. Why? The U.S. government refused to recognize the new Russian Bolshevik government and thus would not barter or negotiate for American prisoner release. This is the story of missing and captured soldiers from the Polar Bear Expedition of 1918, arriving in Russia 2 months before the end of the war to begin an ill-conceived and ill-defined campaign fighting Russian Bolsheviks. Few Americans are aware that 2 months before World War I ended, through an armistice on the Western Front, President Woodrow Wilson sent 5,000 American soldiers to the North Russian port of Archangel on the White Sea. He sent another 8,000 troops to Vladivostok on the Bay of the Golden Horn at the eastern tip of Siberia. Long after Americans in France had gone home, these soldiers continued to fight a savage, now forgotten war. Wilson's purpose in sending these troops started in early 1918 when a Bolshevik delegation led by Leon Trotsky signed a peace treaty with Germany. Bolshevik Russia had left the war, and by leaving had freed 1 million German soldiers for an all-out attack into France. On March 21, a tremendous German offensive opened along a 50-mile front, threatening within a few days to unhinge the Allied line. Because of this development, the Allies thought they could lose the war. It was a desperate situation, producing desperate initiatives. One was a plan for the Allies to intervene militarily in Russia to rally pro-Allied Russians and lead them back to their positions on the deserted Eastern Front to fight Germany. Although the Bolsheviks had seized power in Moscow in August, there were anti-communist forces in Russia calling themselves the White Russians, still battling the Bolsheviks. From the moment the Allies proposed the intervention, U.S. President Wilson opposed it. But under much pressure from the British and French, he eventually assented, with conditions, probably as a lever to manipulate Britain and France at the peace table. The mission for U.S. forces would be very limited. To justify the small intervention, Wilson issued a carefully worded, diplomatically vague memo. The primary U.S. purpose for the expedition was that U.S. troops would guard giant Allied arms caches sent to Archangel and Vladivostok before Russia had left the war. Second, they would support the 70,000-man Czechoslovak Legion, which was former German Allied prisoners of war who had joined the Allied cause and were fighting the Bolsheviks in Siberia. Third, though the memo said the U.S. would avoid intervention in Russia's internal affairs, it also said U.S. troops would aid Russians with their own self-government or self-defense. That was diplomacy speak for aiding the White Russians in the Civil War. So these were the 3 stated reasons American Doughboys went to Archangel in the early fall of 1918. But there can only be one reason why they stayed after the armistice of November 11th, ending World War I. To intervene in a civil war to see who would govern Russia. But to believe that a few thousand soldiers could make a difference in this huge country was a plan destined to fail. The Archangel province alone was as large as the combined territories of France and Germany. The second failure was that the Americans were placed under the command of a British general, Major General Frederick C. Poole, one of His Majesty's most experienced officers. He was leading this Allied expedition, which also included an infantry brigade of Royal Scots, the French 21st Colonial Battalion, a brigade of Canadian artillery, a company of Serbian infantry, and 51 sailors and 3 officers from the U.S. Olympia, chosen for their marksmanship. The Olympia was Admiral George Dewey's flagship at Manila Bay. General John J. Pershing chose the 339th Infantry Regiment for this North Russian duty, principally because its commanding officer, Colonel George Evans Stewart, had served in Arctic Alaska. Organized in August 1917, the 339th, one of the 4 regiments that made up the 85th Division, consisted mostly of draftees from Michigan and a few from Wisconsin. There were so many from around the Detroit area that the regiment called itself Detroit's Own. One man of the 339th would describe the melange of troops as factory workers, farmers, office help, school teachers, some who could neither read nor write from Kentucky or Tennessee, some from Europe who had been in the U.S. for a month or years. A few had been in some trouble and had joined the army to stay out of jail. Among them, too, were Slavic-speaking immigrants, Russians, Poles, and others from Eastern Europe. To a man, all believed and hoped that one day they would steam for Europe and fight on the Western Front. Instead, they were bound for a mission of despair. Upon arrival in Archangel on September 4, 1918, conditions were bleak, the weather brutally cold, and General Poole immediately forced the Americans into combat. As the American soldiers walked down the gangplank, they were greeted by the University of Michigan fight song, The Victors, played by the band from the warship USS Olympia. The Allies defended shelter tenaciously, and when forced to retreat, they torched the shelter in classic scorched earth fashion. The Allied positions were fortified by blockhouses built by the 310th Engineers. The engineers erected over 300 of these blockhouses, log cabins really, of post and beam construction, with sally ports and machine gun slits. They were strategically placed so that one blockhouse was able to support another under attack. In Archangel, there are at best 2 hours of light each day from the late fall until the spring. Dentistry was almost impossible. Medical treatment was severely inhibited along the front lines. Mutiny broke out among the White Russians, the French, and even a British relief regiment. The Americans grumbled and came close to 2 mutinous episodes during the expedition. But the purpose of this video is not to recount the campaign, it is rather to tell the story of the left behinds. Much controversy surfaced in the U.S. while the Doughboys were deployed, because the war was over, yet our soldiers continued to fight in Russia under a British commander. The 339th finally left Russia in June 1919. The U.S. forces in Siberia not until April 1920. Officially, during the Archangel deployment, 109 Americans were killed in action, 35 died of wounds received in action, 100 died in drownings or from accidental causes, and 305 were wounded. Notice these official Secretary of War casualty figures from combat in northern Russia contain no missing or captured numbers, which of course occurs in every war. The real story was that 127 of them were unaccounted for. As I transition now from talking about the Russian expedition to talking about how many of these expedition soldiers were left behind and the details of that betrayal, I'll continue, mostly, to show pictures from the expedition as so many are in existence. The Senate Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs that convened in 1989 looked into the Polar Bear expedition as part of the larger POW/MIA issue, and what they discovered and what its report yields is shocking. A 1930 U.S. Army Assistant Chief of Staff, J2, wrote, "An administrative determination has been placed on each of their records that they were killed in action on the date they were reported as missing." In other words, all the men who were MIA were determined to be KIA/BNR on the date they were reported as missing. Since this determination had been placed on each of their records that they were killed in action on the date they were reported as missing, as far as the United States government and its laws were concerned, these men were legally dead. The trend we see here of concealing the status of missing soldiers and those known interred continued into World War II, the Korean War, and Vietnam. The U.S. government did not publicly admit upon the return of the Expeditionary Force that U.S. military personnel remained as prisoners of the Red Army in Russia, and since captured and missing personnel were listed as dead, it is difficult to know exactly how many of the KIA/BNR list contain captured and missing in action. The POW/MIA report claims the number could be as high as 70 soldiers. The Senate report states the practice of the Secretary of War of lumping the MIA and KIA/BNR numbers together as those killed in action necessarily calls into question the general credibility of these official figures. On April 18, 1921, the New York Times reported on Americans in Russian jails and wrote that the Russians were stating nothing was being done by the U.S. to secure the prisoners' release. Nothing was being done because the U.S. would not recognize the Bolshevik government until 1933 and thus would not negotiate. Refugees from Russia fleeing into Europe during the late 1920s continued to report that a number of Americans were still being held by the Soviet government in forced labor camps. A U.S. Justice Department memo from 1930, per the Senate POW/MIA report, states that an affidavit from a Russian in the late 1920s claims that he was in Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where he saw 4 American Army officers and 15 American soldiers who had been there since 1919, and that he subsequently was transferred to Solovets Island prison, where he met other American soldiers and civilians, some from the Vladivostok expedition. This Russian provided several names, men initially listed as missing in action and later changed to KIA/BNR. As one example, the Russian mentions a Roy Molnar in prison, whom he states had been a sergeant in the U.S. Army at Archangel and from there became a prisoner. Turns out, Roy Molnar indeed was missing from Archangel and nothing else was ever heard from him. There was such a lack of personnel accounting that one historian makes note that 10 U.S. POWs from the Archangel expedition were repatriated through Finland and Sweden. An opening came in 1921, however, when the U.S. and Soviets signed the Riga Agreement to provide American relief for the famine-stricken districts of Russia. Even though the U.S. had not officially acknowledged the Russians held prisoners, a condition of this aid was that Russia would release U.S. prisoners. The U.S. was expecting 20 and was surprised when Russia released 100. And there were still some captured soldiers' names not accounted for. In 1922, veterans of the expedition formed the Polar Bear Association, and from its inception, one of its most important objectives was the return of the bodies of those who died and were buried in Russia. In 1929, with private and some federal funding, a group went to Russia and began exploring for the bodies of their comrades, and actually dug up and brought back 86, although it is believed many remains were misidentified. The group was forced to travel incognito since the U.S. had no formal relations with Russia. 4 years later, several other bodies were returned. In 1933, when the U.S. finally recognized the Russian government, the Russians allowed our graves registration team to visit, and it recovered 9 more bodies. That year, the Russians also released 12 more bodies, which they had in their possession, one being Corporal Earl Collins, who had been captured on March 16, 1919. Later, it was discovered that the U.S. government knew more about the fate of the captured than it let be known. Colonel Herbert Schroeder, for example, went missing while on patrol within weeks of the unit's arrival, and a consular cable reported in 1923 that he was in prison with a British soldier in Moscow. No further news was ever heard of Schroeder. Soldiers of the regiment were so disgruntled over their treatment. After the war, many wrote books on their time in the expedition. I'll show you some of their books and other books and websites you may want to visit to learn more of this expedition. In 1930, a memorial gravestone was dedicated to the polar bears in Whitechapel Cemetery in Troy, Michigan. This site is the final resting place for 56 members of the Expeditionary Force recovered in the 1929 mission. To date, the polar bears remain the only American soldiers to have directly engaged Russian troops on foot. About 24 expedition soldiers remain on Russian soil, somewhere unbeknownst to us. Here are sources for further reading.